everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and another big story out of Europe, and we'll go right into it. As the Telegraph says, high national debt is long-term threat to Eurozone prosperity, warns Moody's. And as the article goes into, Eurozone's debt could hold back future growth unless countries bolster efforts to strengthen their balance sheets, according to credit ratings firm Moody's. The debt of Eurozone governments is still only 4 percentage points lower than at its peak of 94.2% of GDP in 2014. This small reduction in debt so far among the member states has been due to cyclical economic growth rather than a determined effort to raise taxes or cut spending. Efforts to tackle elevated debt levels remains patchy despite the cyclical upturn, Moody says. And it shows a chart below. Germany and the Netherlands are expected to have reduced their already low debt to below 60% of GDP by the end of 2019. This is in sharp contrast to France, Spain, and Italy, where over the next 2 years, the ratings agency expects debt levels will either not have been addressed at all, or they will only be reduced very slightly. France's debt is likely to remain at 95% of GDP, according to Moody's. And then it shows this chart here. Some Eurozone nations still have very high levels of debt. And it shows EA19, Portugal, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, etc. And, of course, there's not much faith to put into a ratings agency like Moody's because the problem's usually worse than what Moody's claims it is. Because, of course, John, you could go into that in more detail about where they put their ratings.
We can talk about the rating agencies all day long here at WAM, but when you look at back in 2008, how they AAA rated a whole bunch of bad collateralized debt obligations, and then, of course, you're looking at how we're now supposed to trust them again from rating countries good. I actually did a Steemit article not too long ago talking about the credit rating of different countries, and I said, most of them should be rated CCC or D as, extremely or close to default.
Yeah, and actually, I want to just quickly mention, because you mentioned credit collateralized debt obligations, which we don't go into enough anymore at WAM, so I just want to explain that quickly. That's a package of a whole bunch of bad mortgages together with a few good ones, and rating them by the top mortgages in this package, and, then you get AAA ratings on, terrible mortgages. It's just, it's one of the things that led to the crash in 2007 in the markets. But anyway, John, can you go into the insanity in the Eurozone?
Well, you showed, of course, the government debt to GDP. I'm going to talk a little bit about how bad the private debt to GDP is in the Eurozone. Mm-hmm. It's not only the pigs, the Portugal, Italy, Spain and Greece and Ireland. That's not all that is bad in the Eurozone. Now, of course, you have countries like Denmark and Sweden that was bastions for socialism in Europe, and Finland as well. In mass amounts of debt, they're top 10. Most of them, except for Finland, is just below. They are accumulating mass amounts of debt everywhere in the Eurozone. And meanwhile, the biggest buyer of debt in the Eurozone is, of course, the ECB themselves through their quantitative easing program. And they bought 1.7 trillion euros in their current quantitative easing programs of debt that they bought. And, of course, most of the debt in the Eurozone is negative yielding. Which means that you invest in the debt itself. If you wanted to be an investor, you actually get less money back in 30 years from now than you would have gotten with positive regular yielding debt. It doesn't make sense at all, Josh. They created this delusion and just complete mirage of an economy in Europe, and a lot of people are saying that the Eurozone is the one to go first because of these crazy policies that have been implemented in the Eurozone.
Well, first of all, how fast is it eroding? How fast are we approaching the major calamity? And on the other hand, on top of that, I wanted to ask, how much of this has to do with the globalist complex instead of the sovereign independence of markets and people, countries, and the individuals within those countries to decide on their own fate rather than this massive complex controlling their every move and basically shoving them into ruin because it's all this debt accumulated, all these problems accumulating all together into one big bubble.
Well, yeah, that's what it's all about, Josh. It's about this mass debt accumulation. And we've reported on countless European banks that have had bail-ins or negative interest rates. Italy is just ridden with terrible banks that are about to implode, and a stock exchange that is, the worst, overvalued in the world. Spain, of course, just had recent bail-ins as well. Austria had.
Basically seizing depositors' money in order to pay off their crazy debts, and then depositor insurance, according to Mario Draghi at the ECB, will be pulled to an extent where people will lose all their money and it's going to be done.
Yeah, well, it all comes down to destroying this whole system. And of course, if Greece or others were to go bankrupt, which they are, and actually really go bankrupt, and it would happen, like they will let it happen instead of bailing them out constantly, the whole Eurozone will fall apart. That's what their biggest fear is, Josh. And of course, we really hope that that's going to happen.
Because you got to rebuild from a free market, free monetary level.
Yeah, well, the Eurozone was created, of course, in order to have peace in Europe after the Second World War. They wanted to have a big global government. Is this whole idea that a big government is going to make peace? The problem is that it was all governments that created the war in the first place. And then you had this big government that took over, and now everything's going to be peaceful.
Yeah, because
they're not understanding what caused it in the first place.
There totally haven't been a whole bunch of meaningless wars since its inception. Totally. No, it's all been peaceful. It's absolutely insane that people fall for that, and then people fall into the trap of believing that it's racism to want to get out of this globalist complex that shoves them into poverty, because a populace in debt and a populace in fear is a populace in servitude, and when they shove you down that bottomless pit of debt, you are forced to ask for a ladder up from the government and the banking system, which puts you in perfect servitude exactly where they want you.
Yeah, well, I want to mention one thing that happened, and I got first account on this, especially my boss that I work with. He is from Portugal, and he was telling me when the euro got implemented in Portugal, suddenly prices jumped to double. So it basically did a 50% devaluation of the currency in Portugal without actually telling the populace. So they have been screwing over the people in Europe for a very long time now, and people are getting very angry. We've seen the protests we just reported on, Greece going bankrupt again. All these protests are just coming from this whole thing of the banking system, the monetary system, and the ravages that they create in the economy. And now we're just seeing it on the European Union scale, which is the biggest we've ever seen in a scale per se, versus any countries that we've seen this happen to before.
Well, this was the end of the script. It was a climax. It's a course of collectivism and the disease that it spreads. And of course, when we see these people rioting in the streets and beating up on police and the police beating up on them, we just see basically the epitome of statism at work. We see government up against wannabe government, statism versus statism. It's all just people infighting instead of fighting the real enemy, and that's exactly where the government wanted them in the first place. And when we see this growth in the bubble that we are watching in Europe, we are watching on full scale what the global complex is all about. It's about debt servitude and just absolute poverty, and it's exactly what we're rushing into right now. And it's so important that people understand what is going on around them so that they can take personal responsibility and be self-sustainable, because that is a hallmark of freedom itself.
Yeah. Well, the European economy has been deflating forever. If you go and look at the numbers from Germany and others, they're severely deflating. And then, of course, with all the government debt and everything in place, they can't have a deflation, because that means less tax revenue in order to pay that ever-increasing debt that they have. So that's why, you had that mass influx of immigrants into Europe in order to try to get people into some jobs, which they terribly missed out on creating any jobs. But what they did, they created people that would vote for them. And that's what's most important, because this terrible government ideas that they put out in the first place, people starting to see through it. And of course, in Germany, there's been people that lived through the Weimar hyperinflation, so they know what's going on there. A lot of people.
Well, I don't know if there's many of those left, because that was like 1923.
There were some though, and they are have been able to tell their stories to their kids.
Yeah.
And people are aware of that. There's a big part of Germany that are fighting back. There's a movement there. And I think we're going to see that, the forces are going to come together, and your smart people are going to say, this is enough. Let's get out of the European Union. Let's crash this whole system, and let's get back to our individual freedoms, because they're losing it rapidly with Spanish policies against protesting. In Denmark, that you can't, make fun of politicians and so on. So there's a lot of government ideas.
The Netherlands as well, yeah.
Yeah, they're just coming in with policies that are trying to stop the populace from the problems they created in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And, history rhymes, much like Mark Twain once said, and we cannot continuously be dependent. You have to rule yourself. Don't be dependent like an animal on a farm eating the grass, saying everything's great, it's a sunny day, I got grass in my cage, and I get to eat, until you are led off to the slaughter. That is exactly what's going to happen. So it's important that we know the solutions. So as we always go into here at WHAM, food, water, shelter, self-defense. You're not gathering things for the toughest guy on the block. Gold, silver, tangible assets, going into the decentralized realm, as well as many cryptocurrencies. It's so important that we get off the centralized grid, stay away from centralization, and decentralize ourselves. And, it's better to be overprepared than underprepared. That's what it all comes down to.
Yeah, look at Greece, look at Cyprus. All of them, they went to cryptos in order to lose all their money in the capital controls and the bail-ins that happened there. So people are waking up in Europe a lot more than they're here. We're more complacent here. At least they're seeing all this ravages happening in Europe. Meanwhile, nobody's reporting on them. But anyways, it's just follow these simple steps of, not becoming reliant on the government, because then you're going to just be standing there begging for them not to put austerity protocols on you and take that money that they promised you, that you became dependent on, back from you, and then you're going to cry in order to, and then you're going to say, well, vote for me, and then I'll give you some more money. And then they have you as a slave.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, rule yourselves, and let's get independence going as a trend. Let's start trending independence and stay away from this dependency on governments and central banks and banks in general, because it only will perpetuate all the problems we've already been facing for so long. So thanks for going into this with us, John. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth.
Be the change.
Like what you see here at WHAM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so overwhelmingly demonetized and censored by YouTube, as the Anti-Defamation League comes in and flags all of our content as hate speech. You can also find me at Josh Sigurdson at steemit.com. That's steemit.com, the future of social media, where you get paid in the upvote of your post via Steem, the cryptocurrency. You can also find our Bitcoin address in the description and the comments below, as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And don't forget to come on down to Anarchapulco in Acapulco, Mexico in February, one of the best events of the year, and you can save money on your tickets by typing in promo code WHAM. That's WAM. We'll leave the link below for you, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe. This is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.